The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. After he had fed the people, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and precede him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them, "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught Peter and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. For you, O Lord, our souls in stillness wait. Truly, our hope is in you. We gather on this day, as we do each week, and it's good to remind ourselves of the reason that we're here, which is to celebrate the one thing, the only thing that really matters, that our God is so unfathomably deeply in love with each one of us. God reveals God's self to us in ways that we often don't anticipate. And God speaks to us in ways we oftentimes don't imagine or even expect. Which makes me wonder, have you ever not noticed God speaking to you? Just to be clear, I'm going to ask that again. Have you ever not noticed God speaking to you? I know that for myself, the answer is yes, and more than once. And that yes comes with the remembrance that I only became aware of that fact well after the fact. In hindsight, in theological reflection. Now, that's not as complicated or profound as it sounds. It's simply looking back at the day or some event or some encounter and taking the time to ask oneself where God was present in that person or that place or that happening. And I can tell you how many times my reflection led me to, "Oh man, how did I miss that?" Today in our scriptures, we're presented with several difficult situations in which God is present, God acts or speaks, and people grapple with the anxieties of life and have to struggle to hear or see God at work. In our first reading from the first book of Kings, during the reign of King Ahab in the 9th century BC, we hear a snippet from the story of the prophet Elijah. The lead up to today's section is that Elijah has just accomplished one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of the Hebrew Scriptures. He got God to send fire upon a water-soaked sacrifice in a challenge with over 300 prophets of Baal, the god worshipped by the king's wife, Queen Jezebel. And Jezebel wanted revenge. We don't hear that Elijah fled for his life to Mount Horeb, that in anguish, discouragement, and despair, he had laid down under a shade tree and begged God to let him die in peace, that he was worn out and frustrated and just wanted peace and quiet. But as is often the case with God, God had other ideas. God calls Elijah from hiding. But he doesn't address him in any of the ways that Elijah would have expected, like in the burning bush when God first called Moses, or the lightning and thunder and fire which were present when Moses received the law on that very mountain, or in a fierce crushing wind or a ground-shattering earthquake. No, God makes his presence known in the sound of sheer silence, in a tiny whispering sound. In the letter to the Romans, Paul expresses his anguish and distress, not because he feared for his life in the moment, as Elijah. No, Paul's anguish was over his own people, the Hebrew people, not recognizing and even rejecting Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah. He was profoundly disappointed in the reality that so few of his people had come to believe in Jesus, especially in light of their entire past preparing them for the Messiah. Paul is so distressed that he says he would willingly sacrifice his commitment to the gospel in exchange for his people to come to believe in Jesus. But the reality is that no one can accept salvation for another. Faith, belief, is a personal choice. It requires an individual acceptance, a free choice. Today's gospel is intended by the author that we call Matthew to teach this late first century audience, his audience, a lesson about Jesus. The story is carefully crafted as an allegory, where characters and events represent something else. Jesus sends his disciples off in the boat representing the church, while he goes up the mountain to pray. Think ascension here. Jesus is separated physically from his disciples, and in the boat of the church, the disciples find themselves in the storm. The audience for which Matthew was writing found themselves in distressing and even dangerous times. The disciples in the boat and Matthew's audience feared for their very lives. In the story, without their requesting him, Jesus appears in the darkness of the storm. And tossed about in the dangerous wind and waves, they see Jesus approaching in ways reserved to God alone, walking on the water, unfazed by the storm. This terrifies them more than the storm itself, because they believe that they're seeing a ghost. All that Matthew says about this is they cried out in fear. And just a footnote here, first century Mediterranean belief in various spirits was quite strong and commonplace, very much unlike our times. Theirs was a belief in both destructive and helpful spirits. Remember that Jesus in his lifetime cast out many evil spirits. When Peter, Jesus' choice to lead his mission on earth, hears Jesus, recognizes him, he doesn't assume anything, but he asks Jesus to command him to come down to walk to him. Jesus' simple response, "Come," was enough to encourage Peter to leave the boat, something every good fisherman of the time would never have done. And as long as his focus was on Jesus, Peter approached Jesus on the water. This was, pardon my term, a leap of faith on Peter's part. But the distraction of wind and the waves, the tumult of life of that time was enough to change Peter's focus, and he began to falter. His exclamation, "Lord, save me," was enough for Jesus to reach out and catch him. Once back in the boat, the storm subsided. Peter did indeed have faith, but it was still an immature faith, much like that of some during Matthew's time. This story is an attempt to show the early church and us that in spite of Jesus not being physically present to us, God does break through in our lives. That breaking through is often not a spectacle or a dark or heavy scenario. God's action is often seen in unexpected ways, and it requires our faith to see God at work. The real miracle of the story is that Peter and the disciples recognized Jesus as the Son of God. This is a story about salvation and the courage that's required to be a disciple. It's okay to be frightened by the storms of life. Just remember to reach out and say, "Lord, save me." Peter took a risk. Being a Christian is about taking risks. So if you've ever not noticed God speaking to you, the challenge for today is first to be open to hearing or seeing or noticing God calling, speaking, and to being open to taking the necessary risks that would allow an encounter with the God who loves you more than you could ever know, which is the very reason that you're here this day, and allows us to proclaim, "For you, O Lord, my soul in stillness waits. Truly my hope is in you."